right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bible Unlocked. If you're joining us for the first time, we're in season 6, and we're looking at the topic this season of faith that stands. Faith that stands, why you should believe the Bible. And tonight we've got another exciting presentation for you tonight. And it's one of our regular hosts and presenters, Dan Robinson, and he's going to be speaking to the topic, the universe, designed or just lucky. Now, if you haven't joined us before, we go through a few different portions of our presentation this evening. There's the main presentation where Dan's going to speak to this topic, the universe designed or just lucky. Then afterwards, we're going to have a short video looking at some of the commandments of Christ. And this week's topic is hurdle your spiritual barriers. And then finally, we're going to have a portion where we dig deeper into the topic of tonight. And we're going to have an opportunity to ask Dan a few questions. And we're also going to pose a question or two to the audience as well. If you have any questions during the presentation this evening, feel free to drop those in the chat. And hopefully we can either address them during that digging deeper portion, or at the very end of our time together, we'll have a few moments to ask Dan some questions if anyone has any. So without further ado, we'll turn the presentation over to Dan.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. It's great to join you again. Really, it's hard to believe that this is already session 15. 5 months ago, we kicked off the season talking about miracles. And then since then, I've been following along with you and really appreciating our guests that have tackled some of the most common objections to trusting the Bible. And tonight, we're going to revisit a big one, which is science, and really just ask a question. Has science ruled out God? And that's really our one goal this evening, is to answer just one question. Should science or modern thinking stop us from trusting the Bible? And I think we'll discover that a growing number of scientists acknowledge that things like biology and astronomy really are pointing towards some kind of design. Now, when I was in university, I studied science, and I can remember the long biology labs. We would do dissections. We would look at microscope slides. We studied the eye and saw layers of structure and function that were truly, to me, astonishing. And I remember commenting to others on the wonder of what I saw as God's creation. But I also remember classmates saying, well, looking at the same things, they'd be saying, isn't evolution incredible? And so their thinking was, science has got this. We don't need God. And the impression that I had at the time was that science had pretty much moved past design and that academics had set God to the side. So while my observations were summarized by a verse that came to my mind about the wonderful works of God's creation and the wisdom that is shown in the things that God has done, I think a lot of people around me in the science world were describing it this way, that God is dead. Now, that's kind of a shocking phrase, and it might seem to be too harsh of a contrast, but I use that deliberately because it came from this German philosopher in the late 1800s, and he wasn't claiming that science had proved there is no God, but what he was describing was a cultural shift, because really, because of science, Western society was increasingly explaining the world without making reference to God. And that was a shift that really gained traction. It's been there forever, but it really gained traction after Darwin. As Darwin proposed that the diversity of life could be a result of small variations and natural selection and survival of the fittest, a lot of intellectual leaders began to say, well, nature is enough. We don't need a creator as an explanation. And I think this sentiment shaped much of 20th century scientific culture, certainly was what I learned in science in high school, and certainly was my impression in university. But you know what? That's not entirely true, because things started to change. That shocking idea that science had ruled out God began to be challenged by new discoveries. So this began quite early. In the early 20th century, astronomers began observing something remarkable. We learned about this in physics. There was Edwin Hubble, a man who you'll recognize from the Hubble Space Telescope. He demonstrated that galaxies are moving away from each other. And not only that, but the further away a galaxy is, the faster it's moving. And that may not seem like much, but that was revolutionary because a lot of people had looked at the world before as being rather static. But he said, okay, if everything's expanding, if you take that backwards and have all the galaxies move closer and closer and closer, eventually they're going to converge to one point. And the implication was then that there's a beginning. And if there's a beginning, there's a natural question. Well, what causes a beginning? Think about everything in life. If there's a book, it has an author. If there's a building, there's a builder. If there's an explosion, which would be a lot like what they described the beginning of the universe, well, then there's a trigger. There's something that starts it. And if the universe was expanding, then it must have come from a point, and there must have been a beginning or a cause. And that's not too far of a jump to think, well, that sounds an awful lot like a creator. And one of the scientists who went on to talk more about this expansion and the universe, this is what he said. This was a Nobel-winning scientist, what he said about the cosmological evidence for the beginning. He said, the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Now, this man, Arno Penzias, was an American physicist who co-discovered cosmic microwave background radiation, this energy that's in the entire universe. And he was, from his observations, saying this points also to a beginning, that there's a finite beginning to the universe, and that it points to what Genesis describes is that at some point in the beginning, there was a creation. Now, not every scientist is like Arno Penzias, who was a believer in the Bible. Often scientists had other suggestions of how this happened. Some propose that there's multi-universes, the multiverse theory. Others suggest that there's other physical mechanisms that we don't yet understand. But the point is that science, when they make these discoveries, they haven't ruled out God. Now, this is incredibly striking when one considers the basic building block of life, which is the cell. So back in Darwin's day, the cell was thought to be a fairly simple blob of living jelly. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but what Darwin imagined was far too simple. It was much simpler than what modern science has revealed. And we understand the cell a little bit like this, although again, this is a huge simplification of the cell. So today we understand with molecular biology and advanced imaging that the cell is staggeringly complex. It has DNA, which stores precise instructions for life. It's got molecular machines like ATP synthase, which function like little motors and provide energy. There's transport and assembly systems that move and build molecules within the cell with perfect accuracy. There's error correction mechanisms that correct against catastrophic mistakes in the cell. And there's these energy systems that power the cell's numerous reactions. So, the basic building block of life is really not basic. It's not a blob. It's more like a city of factories with highly organized information processing. It's rather a remarkable structure. There's a molecular biologist, Michael Denton, who put it rather vividly. He said, to grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometers in diameter and resembles a giant airship. He's using language to help regular people understand, so that it would be large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. And we're still really discovering just how true that statement is. Now, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, Francis Crick, this is what he said. He said, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. And you can see, these are the points that are made by scientists. And the point really is that science hasn't ruled out the possibility of design. Instead, it's really uncovered layers of sophistication that people like Darwin never imagined. So things that once seemed simple now look anything but simple. And the deeper we look, the more life appears to be structured and ordered and full of purpose. And really what we're seeing is that there's a growing number of scientists who are beginning to see that some form of design, not necessarily what we understand as God, but that some form of design is the best explanation for what we're seeing. And perhaps that shouldn't surprise us. Thousands of years ago, a man named David, who had no knowledge of microscopes or molecular biology, he looked at the creation. He looked at the development of a child in the womb, and he said, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, speaking to God. And that was something he understood. Now, fearfully means that that was something he looked at it in inspired awe. And wonderfully was that it was beyond human understanding and comprehension. It was rather extraordinary. So David didn't know about DNA. He didn't know about molecular motors. He didn't know that there's error correction systems. But he did understand that when you truly consider things like the human body, the fitting response should be awe. And I don't think modern science has in any way diminished that awe. It's really amplified it as we start to see more and more of the design and structure. And I want you to think for a minute about, just complexity. If you see something like a smartphone, do you assume that it appeared because of random chance or design? Or you look inside a car engine and you understand that it's taking, energy from gasoline and turning it into motion. Do you assume that that just was assembled by blind force? Or there's a painting masterpiece and you think, well, was that just random blobs of paint that went onto the canvas? Or that mathematical equation on the blackboard, did it just arrive there by chance? And in every other area of life, when we encounter complexity, we correctly assume that there's intelligence and skill and art behind it. So the real question is, why do we suspend that instinct when we look at the universe or when we look inside a living cell? We might think about this verse here. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. For me, that verse expresses what I felt back in my university days. And I wasn't getting into the deep, knowledge of science that's been discovered since. Because everything we looked at was so beautifully complex. So whether we're looking at the vastness of the galaxies or the intricacy of DNA, we just discover more splendor and structure. Well, as you can tell, my idea is just to show that not everything in science points away from God. And there's one area of science that has a marked movement towards the need for design, and it's really that of physics. In recent decades, physicists have discovered something remarkable. The universe runs on a set of fundamental constants. These are fixed numerical values that are built into the laws of nature. And you might think about it as a control panel. So you've got this control panel, and every dial has to be set at just the right spot in order for things to work. And that's the way our universe, they've discovered, is working. There's all these constants. There's maybe about 25 or more of these physical constants. And scientists have focused on about half a dozen of them that they say are so finely tuned that if they were to move just a little way, one way to the other, there wouldn't be life as we know it. Now, just give you one example, gravity. So you may or may not remember from your days in physics, Newton's gravitational constant. It's 6.6743 times 10 to the minus 11. That's a number that comes from physics. And this number is incredibly precise and needs to be incredibly precise. It's actually a fairly weak force, gravity, compared to other forces like electromagnetism and things like that. But even though it's not a very strong force, it shapes the world in which we live. It's essential for stars and planets and galaxies. The the Earth going around the sun, the moon going around the Earth. These things are governed by gravity. And the astonishing part is that if this constant, this number that's so tiny, was slightly different, well, then life as we know it would be impossible. They've calculated that stars would burn hotter and faster and exhaust their fuel too quickly. There might not be stable stars like our sun that would form, and planets would be ripped apart or maybe never even form at all. And if gravity was slightly weaker, the gas clouds that collapse into stars might not do that, and we'd be left in a dark, lifeless universe. And heavier elements like carbon and oxygen and nitrogen that we need for life, they wouldn't be formed in the cores of stars. So you can think of gravity like this thermostat on a very delicate oven, except the oven's the universe. And if the thermostat's a little too high, well, then the stars burn too hot and too fast, and the conditions are too extreme for life. And if it's just a little bit too low, well, then the oven never heats up, and there's no stars that get ignited, and the heavy elements don't form. And so they've discovered that life exists in a very narrow range, and gravity is so precisely defined that it's exactly right for what we need for life. And that's what physicists talk about when they're talking about fine tuning. And what's fascinating is that that's just one of the constants. You can see on our little chart here, there's other forces that are necessary. So there's this force that binds protons and neutrons together called the strong nuclear force. Well, guess what? It's also precisely tuned for life. The electromagnetic force that allows stable atoms and complex chemistry. Well, that's just right. And the cosmological constants, it's just right for galaxies to form. So everything they look at is finely balanced, not too high, not too low, and it's just right. So when scientists have looked at this, these are some of the things that they say. A former astronomer here, Martin Rees, in a book he writes called Just Six Numbers, says the remarkable fact is that the values of the physical constants are such as to allow the existence of life. For example, the strong nuclear force must be precisely what it is to allow for the formation of carbon and oxygen. And then this is the part that's interesting. He says, the universe in some sense just right for life. And what's happening is physicists are looking at this and saying, well, why are they just right? There must be some design to this. And perhaps it's said a little more strongly here by an astrophysicist, Fred Hoyle, who said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology. There are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. So you got to note that, not all scientists are saying these things, and not all scientists are necessarily declaring a belief in the Bible. But what they are doing is acknowledging that the facts that they see are pointing towards design. Even scientists who aren't thinking in religious terms recognize that there's this astonishing precision required for life in the universe. Now, in the Bible, this is how it's put. It talks about God creating the earth, and he created it with a purpose. He established it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. So as we understand it, all these things are in those spots and in those positions because that's how God intended it to be. And so here's the Bible pointing to that intentional design all along. So I guess as we wrap up tonight, we can maybe think about what we've seen when we look at the universe. I guess there's a couple choices we can think that it has been designed by a creator for life with a purpose, or we can look at it as a cosmic accident, that there was just this random alignment of physical constants and that life and consciousness happen by chance. The Bible gives a pretty clear answer. It says in Genesis 1 that God created the heavens and the earth. And in Psalm 19, it adds that the heavens declare the glory of God, that when we look at the heavens and when we look at what's been created, we are supposed to see God. Now, I don't think modern science has silence that declaration. In fact, by discovering the things that they've discovered, in many ways, they've actually amplified that. And there's a few ways of just thinking about it. I find this chart a little bit helpful. What are the explanations to things like why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Well, with the scriptures, with design, we have an answer. There's a creator. Well, science doesn't have an answer. They can't explain why that is. Why is the universe so orderly? Science was pointing perhaps to a lucky accident, although many scientists are pointing to that there must be design. Some are pointing to the fact that, well, maybe there are so many universes out there that just one of them happened to have all the right factors. But of course, from our understanding from the Bible, we realize that this was designed by God with specific laws that would work. And why is life so complex? Well, Darwin pointed to random mutations that would take place. And instead, we understand that there's intelligent design, that God has created us this way. So when we look at this chart, for me anyways, it becomes really clear which explanation is more satisfying and which one makes more sense with the things that I'm able to observe. And of course, that leaves us with a question. So if it's designed, there must be a purpose behind it. Well, what is that purpose? What is the reason for life? And what is the plan that God has for us? So I think really we come back to what we've maybe seen once or twice in these webinars, is that things that we see around us, like science, can explain to us how the universe works. But if we want to know the why and the how and the purpose of life, well, then we've got to turn to the Bible. And we've got to ask that question, well, what is the place that we have in the creation that God has given us?
Well, thanks, Dan, for taking us through that exciting topic, looking at the universe, designed or just lucky. And it's amazing how we have these two groups of people looking at the same data set, and yet they're coming up with such divergent opinions or answers as to how it all came to be. And we look forward to digging into that a little bit deeper with you tonight. We've got a couple questions lined up for you. But before we dive into that, we're going to move on to our second section, looking at one of the commandments of Christ explained. And tonight we're looking at the idea of hurdling your spiritual barriers.
If you've ever watched the Olympics, you might notice the methods that athletes use to shave even the slightest tenth of a second off of their race times. Swimmers wear swim caps to reduce the drag of their hair in the water. Speed skaters, cyclists, and runners wear skin-tight uniforms to reduce air resistance. Even helmets for cyclists and ice sledders are specifically designed so that air easily flows past them. Our walk to the kingdom of God is often described as a race or a contest. And just like the best athletes in the world, we want to do everything we can so that we can finish this far more important race. Paul speaks to this idea in Hebrews 12 verse 1, a verse you've probably heard referenced by us before, which says, "Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us." When we sin, we're deviating from the course. We're weighing ourselves down to slow us down. Sometimes we're even going the wrong way. So how can we lay these sins aside so that we can finish the race? The first thing we have to do is identify what's slowing or weighing us down. There's no one answer fits all. Imagine if swimmers used aerodynamic bike helmets instead of swim caps. It would be completely useless because air and water are completely different properties. They have totally different resistances. So we have to be intentional about pinpointing the sins that we struggle with. Once we've done that, we have to come up with a method that completely cuts it off and eliminates it. Runners don't wear a skin-tight shirt but long, baggy jogging pants. They wear a full uniform to work on eliminating air resistance completely. Similarly, there can't be any half efforts when it comes to removing the sins that weigh us down in our race. They have to be cut off completely. Jesus uses these two steps when he commands the following in Matthew 5. "If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. It is better that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." Notice how Jesus is, 1, specific about where the problem is, your right eye, and 2, he's severe in the method in which you are to deal with it, to pluck it out and cast it away. Not to cover it up or close it or just squint it a little. You have to completely get rid of it. So that's the challenge to us, to follow the commandment of Jesus that gets picked up later in Hebrews, to cast off that which offends our conscience, to lay aside the weights of sin that slow us down in our race. Only then are we able to hurdle our spiritual barriers and finish that race to the kingdom of God.
All right. Well, thanks to our team for putting that video together. Definitely a very practical lesson that we can hopefully take with us each and every day. I don't know if they're doing too many hurdles in the Winter Olympics right now, but definitely a great lesson for us. So thanks, team. We'll move on now to our digging deeper section. We're going to jump back to the topic tonight of the universe being designed or just lucky. And maybe before we jump into some of those theological ideas, Dan, you mentioned when you were looking at the structure of a cell, you mentioned the incredible complexity of DNA, how it's one of those things that's maybe more complex than some of the other components of our cells. You talked about it being like an information storage system. Could you explain that a little bit more, how that works and how amazing that is?
Yeah, DNA is just one of the most incredible things in science for me. Just think about the fact that within every cell in your body, there's a copy of all the instructions that are needed to make you and to make all the proteins that you're needed, and how every cell then is correct for the area in which it's been developed. And all these instructions for what a cell in the eye is needed and a cell in your skin, they're all there within DNA. The other interesting thing about DNA is that it can be copied over and over again accurately. And just picture all this going on at a microscopic level at a speed that's just so incredibly rapid. Think of the development of a baby in the womb that starts with just one cell and doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles, and so quickly becomes trillions of cells that are in our body. And if that's not fascinating enough, there's been this analysis that's been done about the storage capacity of DNA. And in fact, the storage capacity of DNA is so impressive that science is trying to learn from it and to copy it. And again, you got to think, well, if science is trying to learn and copy from DNA, and that just happened randomly, that doesn't make sense. But if it was designed, you can learn from it. Now, let me put that into perspective. So think about all the information that we have created as humans from the beginning of time. And think about the fact that we're trying to store these in data centers. We're storing them in our computers and on our laptops and in the cloud. And if you took the total amount of digital information that humanity has produced over its entire history, science has calculated that you could store all of that data if it was stored in DNA, and it would fit in a space smaller than a shoebox. And I just find that absolutely incredible. In fact, some have suggested that it might even fit in a golf ball. So you've got this DNA, which is the ultimate information storage system. So what they've done is they've figured out how many pairings there are and how you'd store data that way. And a single gram of dried DNA could theoretically store 215 million gigabytes of data. Now, compare that to all these data centers that we're building that occupy hundreds and hundreds and thousands of square meters and that consume so much energy that we're having to create nuclear power plants and all sorts of different energy sources to power these data centers. And on the other hand, you've got this DNA that fits into the microscopic nucleus of a cell, operates at body temperature, doesn't need electricity, but just a little bit of energy from the food that we eat. And it stores all these instructions and all this information. And it's not just a storage system, but it's actually like a blueprint, and it's actively giving instructions and regulating processes and correcting errors within itself and transmitting information from one generation to the next. It's just unfathomable to think that this just happened by chance. It's probably one of the greatest engineering feats ever. And I think it's no wonder that one of the scientists we quoted, Michael Denton, said that it's an object, this is part of the cell, of unparalleled complexity. And why Francis Crick, who discovered DNA, with his co-founder, called it almost a miracle. It's just absolutely incredible. And I wish I could talk more about it, but I think that just gives you an idea of how fascinating and sophisticated DNA as a storage system is.
That's amazing. It's interesting you talking about all these different levels, and it's almost as if the researchers are hoping that the next level they go down will be simpler. It'll be easier to explain, and then every time we pull back a layer, it's just more mind-blowing how everything underneath the surface works. And I don't think we're going to stop even as we go down to nanometers and smaller. We just see these amazing particles that, for lack of a better word, what can we say? They're created.
Yeah, beyond comprehension, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. Moving a little bit more, maybe back to the Bible. In Romans chapter 1, Paul suggests that when humans look at the universe, when you wake up and you go outside, when you look at the trees and the plants, or maybe you're out on a nice, a clear night and you see the stars moving and everything around you, that Paul says that should be an evidence of God. Now, why do you think that so many people they don't perceive this today? Why is that? Why is that a challenge to them? And maybe, well, just give you a minute to think about that. Maybe we can put a question to our audience. What are some reasons that you might think of for why people might want to exclude the possibility of God creating all these things? How could that affect your life? How could that affect someone's life to exclude the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful creator?
Well, maybe I'll just put up that verse you're referring to from Romans, where it suggested that people should be able to look at some of these things we've talked about tonight, and they should see God. And the Bible says it leaves them really without excuse. And I think it goes back, Jamin, to where I was sitting in university looking at something that another student sitting next to me comes to an opposite conclusion. And for me, that was kind of difficult to understand how they would come to such a different conclusion. But when you think about it, there's probably a few reasons why that happens. And I think one of the things is that we're a little distracted right now. Back in the day, I think there was more time to think about these things. And now our lives are so busy that we aren't actually taking the time to think about what those things represent. The Bible also talks about the fact that we aren't focused on spiritual things, but we're relying on ourselves. We get to a point where humans just think that we can explain everything. We've made such great advancements. We've accomplished so many things that you come to the point where you think, well, then I think we can explain everything. So that's, I think, part of the problem. One is that we're too busy. One is that we have this self-reliance. Back in the day in the scriptures, it was that people had other gods. They had other explanations. That was the problem. And if we think about other gods in our days, those are the things that take our time and our energy and that we're focused on. But probably the most important thing, I think, is just the humility and teachability that are required to allow something like the scriptures to change us and to be able to visualize God. So I don't know that I have the exact answer for that one. There's probably different reasons for different people. But the Bible does tell us that it leaves us without excuse, that we really should be asking questions. We're not going to find the answers in science, but we will find them in the scriptures if we have the courage to take a look.
I think that's a great explanation. And really, yeah, it takes you back to the Bible if you have the courage, as you said, the courage to look at it, to consider that this is more than just random chance.
Mm-hmm.
We see a few answers coming into that question about why might people want to exclude the idea of or possibility of God being a creator or there being a creator. Jonah and Hannah say it means no obligation to listen to the difficult truths that the Bible shares. And yeah, that's definitely something that can be a stumbling block to people. If you accept that there is a God, well, then you have to look at what that God has asked people to do. And of course, that puts up a lot of stumbling blocks, as another person mentioned here in the chat. The moral imperative required with a faith in God. Yeah, there's an expectation to act and to change. And then Kathy's got here, people may feel they can't live up to God's expectations. So maybe you've considered the idea of a God, and then that has sort of shattered everything about you. And of course, that can be true for people as well. They see the expectations of a God who can do all of this, and sort of that's as far as they can ever get. So yeah, there's definitely a few reasons why people might want to exclude God. Unfortunately, as Paul said, as Dan mentioned tonight, there's a witness to God and it's everywhere around us. So hopefully that sort of piqued your interest in looking at the Bible and hopefully looking at the things of the world around us and recognizing that maybe something created that and maybe there's something more out there for me, because I think that's exactly what God wants us to think about when we look at the wonders of creation, the things we can see, and of course the things that we have to get out some scientific devices to see as well. So thanks, Dan, for joining with us tonight and sharing this pretty amazing topic. So we'll bring our time together here to a close, and we'll just prep you for next week's topic. If you're able to join us again, the next week's session is on anti-Semitism was predicted in the Bible. So hopefully you can join us for that session next week. And as we bring our evening to a close, we mentioned earlier, Dan and I will stay on for a couple minutes. And if there's any questions or comments that you have in the audience, feel free to put them in the chat and hopefully we can address them. And if you don't want to ask them tonight, if you'd rather send them privately, we also have a few places that you can reach us at as well. You can reach us at our email address, questions@bibleunlocked.com, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you send to us as best as we can. And also, if you want to reach out or find out more about us, we have a few different social accounts. Feel free to check those out. And as always, we'll post the replay of this video on YouTube. So if you wanted to hear something again, or if you didn't quite understand it the first time, feel free to go back and listen to it again, or listen to one of our previous week's episodes as well. Those will all be posted.